Assorted herbivores essentially form the megafaunal backbone of Spec settings, more interesting than creating soil and plants, and necessary for creating fodder for popular carnivores. A Spec setting is only as good as its herbivores. But despite this, they can still suffer from misconceptions too, most of all that being one is simple or easy, and that they all function the same way. Rather, herbivores are complex animals, and not just repetitive grazers. The last video started with placing carnivores on the ambushed cursorial pipeline, whereas herbivores are arguably more complex than that. After all, herbivores can be argued to have more things in their lives they need to react to, and different ways of doing so. And whilst carnivores are stuffed to the brim with general misconceptions, the lesser role of herbivores as antagonists means they've dodged some bullets, but not all of them. There are still some tropes that can tend to follow them, and one of these I've noticed is social behaviour, or rather its lack of diversity in it. It's not that fictitious herbivore social behaviour is necessarily bad, but more that it tends to fall into one of two categories. The first being equid-like social structure, a harem of females and their young under the protection of a strong dominant male who chases off rival males and predators alike, likely stemming from Bambi and its king of the forest notion, perhaps to give the idea of a wilder nuclear family. Creatures like Pandora's Titanotheres and Skull Island's Feructus are examples of equid social systems in fictional herbivores. Equids live in groups called harems, which are groups of females with a dominant male keeping them together and fighting off other males trying to sneak in. It's worth noting here the belligerence of male equids to predators, as often seen in speculative herbivores too, isn't always the norm, and many have useless males in this regard that don't provide much protection like many deer species. So this trope is fine, though it perhaps should still be regarded as a unique behaviour nestled in a more common one of the harem. The other more common one is of course the faceless herd, a giant conglomerate of animals that are essentially uncooperating individuals, all solely together for vigilance. Pandora's dire horses are one such example, and Monster Hunter's Aptonoth are often portrayed as such when en masse too. But seemingly faceless herds can be more complex and more interesting than first thought though, and can be rich in applicable behaviours. Cape buffalo are one such well-studied example, with the cows forming their own miniature subgroups of dominance chains in the herds that partially interlink with others. Animals in the large herds have distinct roles, with the animals consistently showing the same positions in the herd. The leading animals are known as pathfinders, and are generally the ones making all the decisions for everyone involved. But this consistency costs the rest of the herd dearly. The front animals get the most feeding opportunities, and by the time the rearguard arrive, most food is already depleted, leading to them being the first to decline in physical condition. As their main predator, lions, often attacks from the back and selects those in poor condition, they're essentially the predation buffer for the rest of the herd too. But herds beneath a certain size and without sufficient pathfinders would go extinct quickly. So there's not really much chance for upward social mobility, as calves inherit their mother's position, and these rearguard animals can't fission to form their own herds. Some animals just don't have much luck. Wildebeest are perhaps an example of the faceless herd played entirely straight though. Whilst there are some occasional nuances, the herds often still show sexual selection as do many ungulates, and the herds are often led by the testosterone-emboldened bulls in migrations. Richard Estes essentially describes the herd as a collection of strangers. They're a gregarious species, but one with, thus far, little real organisation or genuine socialisation. To the naked eye, a buffalo herd and a wildebeest herd may seem similar, but one is generally more complex than the other despite the numbers and similarities between members. So the two most common tropes of either the happy family or the faceless herd,
we are the legion of the beast,
can be played straight or with extra factors changing them up. Dinosaurs also got together in such massive herds too, although obviously behaviour only rarely fossilises. The major groups of saurian herbivores all showed that at least some species showed herding and mass herding, but it's generally impossible to say if they resemble the faceless herds of wildebeest, the more intricate herds of buffalo, or unrelated collections of multiple harems drawn together like zebra at river crossings. But if nothing else, it shows dinosaurs did have social behaviour, even if we may never fully tease out what it best resembled. Herbivore social systems overall and in general can be complex and varying. Bush pigs, for instance, live in their typical nuclear family, a pair of breeding adults and their young of varying ages, with the boar also being a diligent and protective father. Eland can be very weird, with immensely fluid social structures with essentially no long-term bonds, whilst mothers/the herd in general will group together to defend attacked individuals and their calves from predators, although this is less well known and less successful than when buffalo do it. Even mothers and calves are pretty fractious, as once the latter are weaned, they essentially run off to form their own teenager herds, completely on their own, without breeding adults, who also tend to sexually segregate outside of breeding. At least some dinosaurs may have actually been similar too. In multiple species of herbivorous dinosaur, including an ornithomimid and an early sauropod ancestor, fossil evidence shows age-segregated groups, with a juvenile-only flock of the former found being trapped in the mud of a drying water body, and the fossils of the latter typically being found in age-segregated herds. There's also evidence for this in at least some ankylosaurs too. And a lot of other herbivorous dinosaurs may have also lived in age-segregated groups, over the more sex-segregated groups a lot of modern herbivores live in. Different dietary needs and movement abilities may encourage animals to split up, but the benefits of sociality seems to keep them together, in such social age groups which may have been common in dinosaurs. Elephants may be the peak of herbivore sociality, with complex fission-fusion social systems of female family groups that will merge and split with other family groups depending on various factors. This level of sociality is quite rare, and is limited to more cognitively advanced species like elephants or certain primates. So whilst it shouldn't really be the norm, this is definitely something that can be present. These are just a few examples of how different social systems can be outside of the more typical examples. As well as this, I think one concept it'd be good to get to grips with for anyone making fictitious herbivores in general is the bachelor herd, or indeed the bachelor male, and figuring out what your males are doing in general. A bachelor herd is essentially as it sounds, a group of males together in a single-sex herd. Already, some may be surprised by this, with the notion that males are all rutting roidheads living to fight. But these herds essentially form as males and females often have different needs, and different behavioural drivers that split them up outside of the universal drivers, like migration or breeding. Males generally want as much energy as they can get to build and maintain condition to win females, whereas females want to rear their young to be as healthy and safe as possible. So in some cases, males will willingly risk higher threat of predation, which they may or may not be better equipped to repel, for better quality food to bulk up on. But the two sizes can thusly sometimes come with some caveats. The larger males can often better digest poor quality forage, and so as a result may reduce intraspecific competition for better forage, and rather reduce foraging movements to save energy by foraging in poorer quality areas. Smaller females may have no choice but to be more selective. When organised into these groups, the relationships between males can vary. In some cases there are no real bonds, and it's simply shared vigilance. But in more advanced behavioural systems, males can have considerable roles to play. Elephants are a good example here, and after years of thinking bulls just functioned as bad-tempered sperm donors, it's now known bachelor herds have their own hierarchies going on. Younger bulls follow older males to learn more about their surroundings and worthwhile information for their survival. The old bull essentially fills the role of the matriarch for the younger males. Their presence in a group changes the behaviour of others, calming younger males in stressful scenarios. Whilst giraffes aren't quite as cognitively or socially advanced as elephants, male giraffes do seem to show similar behaviours, as well as basic vigilance. In all male herds, the younger bulls seem to learn various survival skills from their elders too, sometimes shadowing them specifically. So these bachelor herds can vary in their complexity as much as any social system. Singleton males will still live their lives alone quite happily, and this is often seen in more territorial animals. Whilst females are the goal, you also can't pursue non-territorial females and try to maintain a territory at the same time. So single males will hold down their own patches and wait for females to enter or entice them to do so, with the stronger males winning the better quality and more enticing patches, and thus a greater likelihood of females. Sometimes this can be seasonal or permanent, but overall it's not unusual for males in some species to spend much of their time alone. On this, mating systems aren't all social systems are about, but they are often a core part of what makes a social system. And handily, a lot of research has been done on what terrain affects what social system ungulates will adopt. One thing is whether herbivores are territorial or not. The most basal mating system is arguably pair territories. The male and the female hold their own overlapping territories they defend from other members of the same sex. This is typically found in animals like rainforest duikers, and is pretty basic. Monster Hunter's Diablos fit this category, one of both sexes living in shared territories with their huge size and arid habitats, giving them minimal sociality and maximum territoriality, compared to their smaller and more gregarious herbivores in lusher regions. Next up is more common, which is polygynous resource territories. This is essentially where the male holds a territory over certain resources others of his own kind want. Obvious examples being things like food or especially water, but can really be anything you choose. He then attempts to mate with females when they come for resources and chase away other males, though they may be tolerated if young or if it's out the season if they're seasonal reproducers. Something like Soyalee's red racers are an example here, with the dominant male controlling the area around a waterhole, and thus getting his pick of the female groups that come to that area. Something often more exclusive to open areas in larger animals due to the need for higher numbers of them is lekking. This is where all the males gather to certain areas to display, with the males with both the best position in the lek and the best display typically winning the hearts of visiting females who leave soon after. The males will stay for the entire duration usually, and may not feed or rest much in this duration, losing condition by the end with some even dying, or at least being a lot more susceptible to predation. Skull Island's Ligocristus are seemingly described as lekking, with the males coming into breeding colours and picking certain areas to call and display at certain times of the year, with the goal of accruing female interest, and occasionally suffering VREX-related consequences towards the end of the season. Non-territorial examples include the previously mentioned harems as well as mate tending, where a dominant and usually large and impressive male tends to females when in estrus, sticking very close to them and blocking them from other males. Tending is seen in forest environments and herds too large for one male to try and handle all of them. It's also the most common system seen in mountain environments, and this may stem from the trade-offs mountain ungulates face. Older males select for size and bulk, for fights and to chase off smaller males. So smaller males do have a mobility advantage on the cliffs that they can use for sneaky matings. Mate tending may be a way of trying to cancel that early. It may seem an odd side tangent to go off on ungulate love lives, but what the females are doing and then what the males are doing to try and get them can often be a major factor in how social systems initially form. Understanding that, in conjunction with which environments favour what, leads to appropriate decisions being made law-wise. Small animals at low densities favour monogamy between infrequent individuals with small territories. Open plains result in more animals and encourages animals to stick together for more vigilance against predators. Animals being together mean there are multiple females, and greedy males want to mate with as many as they can. Greedy males result in increased sexual dimorphism and elaborate signals and weaponry to compete for said females. As with carnivores and how cursors that evolved for open plains can move back into wooded areas, species like forest elephants also show that large social herbivores can still make it in dense rainforest environments, even if they evolved out of them and then can move back in. And then there are of course gorillas and chimpanzees, who aren't ungulates but the former can be considered large herbivores. Because terrain is important for general evolution too. Like carnivores and their coursing versus stalking though, One of the biggest things to set a ball rolling in evolutionary ecology is the transition from forest to grassland. Or perhaps this should be from closed to open habitat. Many of the differences aren't necessarily solely due to plant composition, but more from the shape of the environment around them too, and so can be replicated at least partially with other and/or equivalent dietary resources. With modern ungulates, they start from small origins in closed habitats like rainforests, evolving from herbivores like duiker, muntjac, and small pigs. These animals have what is known as a slinker build, small with muscular hindquarters and small weaponry. Slinker animals tend to live in good numbers with overlapping male-female territories, and their social structure is typically limited to mating, mother and young, or opportunistic interactions. These are represented to some degree in fiction too, with Avatar's hexapods being reminiscent of such herbivores, and seemingly living similar lifestyles too. This may not be the case for all herbivore families, and Ornithischian dinosaurs have seemingly small and simple origins but stemming from open arid scrub, rather than deep forest. But there does seem to be the same pattern of lackluster beginnings also appearing with dinosaurs like Lasutosaurus, who was relatively small and unornate. They do seem lightly built, with the potential to be quick though, so you could tentatively suggest a sprinter origin for open areas, to pair with a slinker one for closed ones. When the small get big and come out into the open though, changes happen. One of the biggest changes it'll already implement is slanting herbivores into the browser to grazer pipeline. Browsers being herbivores that typically eat leaves, branches, buds, or generally anything on the taller plants. Despite often eating trees, it's worth noting browse is defined by its role on the plant only. Browsers can be small if the plants are small too, and grouse are some of the true bird browsers that typically eat plants just a foot or two in height. Grazers obviously eat the shorter growing herbaceous plants like grasses and forbs, that are much lower lying. There is of course then the middle option, which is creatively known as a mixed feeder. And as is often the case, there is leeway here. Even animals often viewed as strict browsers like giraffe will graze, and strict grazers like cattle species will browse. But despite such ecological partitioning that animals often undergo, morphologically there isn't much on the outside to differentiate a browser from a grazer, excepting extreme individuals like giraffes. Much of it occurs internally, with differences in the organs like the liver or salivary glands, which are larger in ruminants to deal with the greater amount of toxins and plant compounds found in leaves. Grazers do have larger and taller teeth, typically to deal with the greater wear that comes from grazing, and often the amounts of grit ingested too. This can often result in them having longer skulls and broader muzzles too, with examples of horses for the former and hippos for the latter. Browsers often have more narrow muzzles to better select and snip leaves. Mixed feeders that eat both will likely look more like a browser, as browsing is the ancestral condition for the vast majority of herbivores unless specified otherwise in your world, so grazing has to evolve separately with the evolution of true grasslands or equivalent biomes. True grazers are actually evolutionarily relatively new on our planet. It's just that we domesticated two of them to become the most well-known and widespread herbivores on the planet that we think this is more the norm. Black rhino could be considered one such example of something that appears a clear browser, but is really a mixed feeder. With its shorter neck, higher head and mobile lip to crop and shear branches, it was originally believed to just browse, until more modern findings discover that this more stemmed from it being blasted out much of its former range, where it lived as a mixed feeder with a lot of grazing. Recent studies from Kenya show they may even prefer grass in some cases too, or seasonally at least. There's not really an answer for if one feeding type is better than the other due to it being an apples to oranges comparison. But it could be worth noting mixed feeders do show both great theoretical and practical success. Impala are one of the best known examples, and have been essentially unchanged for 5 million years, and are often the most abundant herbivores across most of southern Africa. Elephants are also very successful too, representing huge amounts of herbivore biomass in protected areas even when accounting for size, stemming from the variable diets, which is also what allowed them to radiate back into forest environments. So, as is often the case when dealing with depth, it's hard to sell certain types of animals purely in visual design except for extreme cases. Again, the giraffe. A lot of that has to come from lore and world building. Specifications of browsing or grazing are rare in fiction, as most creators just view plants as a monolith, and so don't specify much more than that. The assorted herbivores of Skull Island are a welcome change, and have a nice diagram showing the different feeding strata of the different dinosaurs. And such things likely do apply much more to some dinosaurs than to modern mammals. Feeding height strata has been hypothesized on for rich dinosaur guilds, with it resembling the lineup you'd expect. Taller hadrosaurs that can also rear up browse the highest, ceratopsians consume the middle levels, and ankylosaurs feed on the lower levels, with some evidence they may actually rootle and forage like pigs in the leaf litter and undergrowth. Despite similar partitioning occurring to some level with grass, in modern ungulates it's much more a question of water availability and dependency determining who feeds where rather than height, presumably as most ungulates don't have quite the same morphological differences as did the assorted dinosaur park species. Whilst there is some partitioning, there is a lot more overlap than first thought, especially for browsers on the lower levels, as the tall can generally access what the small are already eating too, but not vice versa, so it's less specified into small, medium and tall, and much more the giraffe and then everyone else. As well as being browsers due to grasslands or equivalent biomes not occurring in the Mesozoic, dinosaurs would chiefly have been hindgut fermenters, a method still used today along with rumination. The two have their different strengths. Ruminants do better when the quality of food is limited, because their more extensive breakdown of plants with repeat processing leads to it being converted into more nutrients. So with a small amount of good food, they can essentially get more from when the going is good. Hindgut fermenters just bung it all in the back and let their microbes sort it out. Once they've swallowed it, it's out of their hands. As such, hindgut fermenters do better when the quality of food is an issue. They can easily process huge amounts of crap vegetation relatively quickly, without any need for them to do anything more to process it. It doesn't get broken down as comprehensively, but with the volumes processed, so long as they get some of the nutrients, that doesn't matter. Whereas ruminants are comparatively time limited, as they need time to stop consuming more food and process the food already eaten. And time is a limiting factor for herbivores, with predation, tannins, the need for rest, movement and water, or how much food there is, all limiting how much time you get to browse or graze. So a ruminant can't waste time eating something that only has a small amount of what it needs, or takes too much time to break down. When the quality gets bad, ruminants have to spend more time grazing, due to being more selective with longer search times. It's worth noting size here too, and its impacts. All large dinosaurs were hindgut fermenters or roughly equivalent digestive systems. And this is because for one, the bigger you get, the more efficient it is, as past a certain point the gut retention times in ruminants work against them. Any longer than 4 days and the associated bacteria start to have problems breaking things down. But also that plants don't scale with herbivores. If a 20 kilogram deer and a 20-ton sauropod both browse the same tree, it's not like the sauropod is eating bigger leaves than the deer or anything. They're consuming the same plant size, and plants are also generally limited by size. So that same leaf has to travel through 40 foot of deer intestine, but 200 foot of sauropod intestine and assorted guts. All that extra time makes for a more comprehensive and effective digestion. So at giant sizes, hindgut fermenters outcompete rumination. But if plants did scale with herbivores, and some spec herbivores had a different guild of microbes to help them, maybe rumination could stay more relevant. Monster Hunter's Duramboros is canonically a ruminant, and that universe has giant ferns and giant trees in the old and new world. Whilst Duramboros does canonically eat trees, and wood, this could also be some explanation for how it managed to get where it is as a ruminant. Being a herbivore is a broad term, and can encompass smaller dietary niches that can also be considered their own things. Frugivores are one such example, and other animals would consider herbivores, can also be near exclusive consumers of fungi, flowers, grain and nuts too. Some herbivores can be pretty generalist and take a little bit of everything that plants provide, and some animals will even eat the wood too. Wood eating is seen in both extant and extinct herbivores, and in the former is likely due to the fact certain trees break down and provide sodium, which is a pretty vital mineral for animals that don't live in societies wallowing in it as we like to. In extinct animals, it seems the wood itself harboured more nutritious treats that made the wood itself worth eating too. Hadrosaurs ate wood that was seemingly full of crustaceans, and also full of fungi too. It seems the fungi breaking down the wood may have made the contents of the wood itself much easier to digest too, and so more profitable to eat. But that is something of a reoccurring theme with subgroup herbivores, is that they're normally eating far more nutritious and energy-dense foods than typical herbivores, i.e. browsers and grazers. All the example foods given are just generally not things that need to be specialised into to the same extent. They're generally a lot easier to process. On top of this, they're also very seasonal resources, only occurring in bloom for half the year, if that. Whilst this is partly true of browse and graze too, in many cases there is still browse or graze available, it just becomes much lower quality, so that animals naturally lose condition and sometimes perish in the lean periods. But the foods they're specialised into are still present. Subgroup herbivores often have fallback foods to eat in lean periods outside of resource blooms, or mast years. The pig-like prehistoric Coryphodon was found to subsist off fungi, wood and the leaf litter itself in the less productive winter months, with toughened enamel to do so. In primates, these foods can often be leaves, and in chiefly nut-eating pigs, in poor mast years they'll very often take to human crops. But in more natural settings, will diversify their diet to include more plant matter, especially grasses and their roots. This was likely the case in many extinct animals too. More recent research shows entelodonts not as the carnivorous, shrink-wrapped hell pigs of the early 2000s, but more like giant boars, water-dependent generalists that may have taken carrion or small animals, but weren't top predators. So it's hard to be completely dedicated dietarily in such regards. And in this vein, animal matter can also come up as an occasional food source too. All it takes is a single clip of a deer eating a chick for annoying comments like, "There's no such thing as a true herbivore," to surface. So let's also break down how and why herbivores may occasionally eat other animals. As established, in subgroup herbivores they're used and adapted to high-energy, nutritious diets. And so the move from nuts or fruit to animal matter isn't too big a jump. As said, this can be seen in pigs, who take a lot of invertebrates or carrion, normally frugivorous primates who dabble in predation enough for their own Spec Evo short, or even birds like parrots, who despite being a family of specialised frugivores and nectivores, may scavenge animal matter too, or eat invertebrates like caterpillars for protein and minerals, so Skull Island's carrion parrots were not actually that far off the mark. Far more specialised herbivores like true browsers and grazers do this in cases of mineral deficiency. This is very rare to see, as in most functioning ecosystems there will be sufficient material in animal carrion that they can get their fix, and so it's not uncommon to see ungulates gnaw bones for calcium, or other minerals, in a behaviour known as osteophagy. But in areas like islands, herbivores like red deer may well eat seabird chicks as the barren ecosystems don't have enough minerals otherwise, especially at times of the year when they have to sustain antler growth, which is a pretty expensive process. With no bones to gnaw, the baby birds provide the best route to more calcium. The description of both the processes of eating and the parts eaten, which in some cases the birds may even survive, show that this is a mineral-driven behaviour and not a craving for meat itself, or any natural urge for predation. The same deer will also scavenge birds killed by the process of eating from other deer, and show no predatory behaviour associated with movement or such. So there's a considerable gulf between mineral deficiencies in browsers and grazers, and the occasional predation seen in subgroup herbivores used to high-energy diets. And then another gulf again between that and being a full-blown obligate carnivore. On long evolutionary timescales, the herb can indeed become the carnivore, and it can be worth noting some adaptations that can transfer across both too. Baleen whales provide an interesting example, with gut biomes resembling a mix of both carnivore and herbivore from their hindgut fermenter ancestry. Obviously, since the Eocene, they've developed all they need to break down proteins from a seafood diet, but they still retain fermentation chambers and herbivore-like gut bacteria, which seems to be to break down chitin. This is the most abundant biopolymer in the sea, due to animals like krill, and with an ancestry of breaking down cellulose, which is the most abundant biopolymer on land, there's some skill transfer there. So it's believed baleen whales still use this to better extract energy from their diet of marine invertebrates. For terrestrial herbivores, this has some Spec implications too. Whilst pangolins were already present by the Eocene, and so had beaten other families to the myrmecophage punch, although it doesn't seem a hugely competitive niche, it doesn't seem overly far-fetched for a family that used to ferment cellulose to switch to fermenting chitin on land too, in areas with plentiful invertebrates to eat. There can be some backwash too, and carnivorans and carnivores may occasionally sample high-energy plant matter like fruits and nuts. Crocodilians will actually quite readily take easy-to-digest fruits, and bears are a family that, despite still being able to digest meat well, and engage in occasional predation, get much of their nutrition from assorted plant matter, due to evolving early to take on more low-protein and generalist diets. In some bear species like pandas and spectacled bears, they're essentially entirely herbivorous. Again, there's a gulf between occasional fruit consumption and getting most of your food from grass, but in the right circumstances, animals can move between fairly compatible diet styles if certain macronutrient overlap already exists. Another impact closed versus open has is herbivore weaponry. Herbivores will typically have much smaller weapons, often for more direct combat, like short horns or tusks, in closed habitats, and then much larger flamboyant ones that can be lethal, but start as tests of strength, like antlers, in open ones. More space resulting in less risk of getting snared in vegetation, as well as open, uncluttered views of your opponent, allow for lengthy posturing, which favours flamboyance and show, rather than the occasional back-alley knife fight of forest combat. This also applies to individual classes of herbivore weaponry themselves too. Open antlers will be much bigger than closed antlers, open tusks will be much bigger than closed tusks, and so on. For example, compare the antlers of a monarch of the glen red deer stag to those of a jungle muntjac, or the horn of a Javan rhino to those of a black or white from the more open environments. More space just equals bigger, showier weaponry, regardless of the weapon, it seems. The dependence of herbivores on a single weapon also leads to exaggeration of such weapons too, which is to say, the more weapons they have, the smaller and less impressive they usually are. Let's just repeat that and louder. The more weapons something has, the less big and impressive they usually are. Again, rhinos can serve as an example here. Indian rhinos have small horns as they also use their canine teeth to bite in fights as well. But such teeth aren't the size of something like a hippo. A true horn user, like a black or white rhino, has much larger horns, and a true biter, like a hippo, has much larger teeth. Commitment to a weapon leads to its most impressive form. In the event of herbivores having multiple weapons, then the signalling weapon is the one that most likely becomes larger. Weapons for pure combat, as in weapons where there's no show, display or test of strength, and it's just all violence, often don't need to be large and flamboyant, they just need to be strong and functional, whereas a signalling weapon still has to be used to engage in some fair play first, and so becomes the flamboyant option. Something that could serve as an example could be Monster Hunter's Diablos. Best known for their huge horns, they also have a tail club that can occasionally be used for combat. This seems to be the ancestral weapon for the flying wyvern family, but one that hasn't reached the extremity of brute wyverns like Glavenus or Duramboros, as Diablos has fairly obviously grown the signalling weapons of the horns instead. Diablos is also too big and heavy to fly, and violent herbivores are rare. It's worth noting even in a lot of fictional worlds, often ones with many giant flying organisms, the herbivores can still be flightless. Diablos isn't alone here, its cousin Monoblos is also flightless too. But this does make sense, because graze or browse takes a lot of time to digest, and so requires long, muscular and heavy guts to break things down efficiently, and guts that are often full or continuously being filled with a conveyor belt of vegetation. Not something you really want if you're flying. So flight and being a browser or grazer just don't really mix well, because even with the wonky rules of giant flyers, it's still generally regarded you'd want to be carrying the least weight, and a grazer or browser is likely to be constantly carrying more weight than animals of other diets. Hence why most birds that can still be considered herbivores that also fly a lot will consume high-energy plant parts like seeds or fruit, rather than leaves. Giant fictitious frugivores or nutcrackers are as believable as any fictitious flying carnivore, and it's not impossible to have much larger volant herbivores, but ones that fly regularly and/or very long distances would be unlikely if you're trying to go for a more realistic setting. Ones still clinging to flight as a quick temporary predatory escape, or to hop over otherwise impassable terrain, aren't impossible. And plenty large volant birds live their lives as ground animals with rare snippets of flight for special occasions, for those looking for more grounded volant herbivores. The biggest extant birds are herbivorous, and are often frugivores or grazers, and have dispensed with flight entirely. There is a volant middle ground, of birds that are true grazers, but they're very often heavy, with massive wings, lengthy takeoffs, and plenty that only fly once or twice a day, if that. These birds of course being true ducks, geese and swans. These birds prefer to use water to both live, move and flee into, rather than taking flight if they can help it. So on this note, what about aquatic herbivores too? And these are split into 4 groups. Aquatic herbivores that live in the water and eat aquatic vegetation like manatees or sea turtles, and don't really have too much option to leave it. Semi-aquatic herbivores, like the aforementioned swans, which are adapted to water and eat aquatic vegetation, but can leave the water both in general and to feed. Semi-aquatic central place herbivores, that live in the water and eat terrestrial vegetation, like hippos or beavers, and terrestrial herbivores. These are herbivores that can just use water for drinking, but are often closely tied to aquatic environments for important aspects of their ecology, be it food, thermoregulation, or predator escape. Examples being animals like water buffalo, or deer like moose or barasingha. These herbivores can still have very strong impacts both in land and water, and the grazing pressure underwater can still be intense. Just like on land, animals like manatees, swans or turtles will still maintain grazing lawns, areas of very close cropped vegetation with high reproduction rates, sometimes to the point of overgrazing if their predator populations aren't present to regulate them. Central place herbivores can contribute heavily to aquatic ecosystems, bringing nutrients back to the water in the form of their dung, or altering waterways with their movements or structures. For air-breathing animals, aquatic herbivory is difficult and restricted due to depth. Light penetration into the water column will limit vegetation growth beneath a certain level, meaning no food. And even in very well-lit waters, you'd still have to be very good at holding your breath to sink to the bottom and graze for sufficient amounts, before needing to return to air. There's often not a lot to eat between the benthos and the surface too. So aquatic herbivores like manatees and hippos are localized to certain rivers, and more to coastlines and islands than deep open water systems. Central place herbivores like hippos typically leave rivers to eat, as there just isn't enough vegetation growing in lakes or rivers to sustain a whole pod of them. And this is likely the case for aquatic central place herbivores in general too. Marine herbivores are also a thing, and some fish will eat plant matter in the open ocean where it's pretty rare, but more in the form of algae. These fish are also amusingly known as browsers and grazers too, but more refers to the algae the fish eat. Browsers eat the small filaments in the water column. Grazers eat the larger macroalgae growing on things, with a good example being parrotfish, who can be watched scraping up the algae in reefs. Some seaweeds can form long chains and become quite abundant at the surface, like sargassum. This can be pretty important for many species, and for things like sea turtles, it's now believed it may provide food species or cover, depending on the species, for the baby turtles in their early years of life. Whilst the sargassum rafts perhaps aren't dense enough for a large population of marine megafaunal herbivores, any spec setting with such dense rafts could well support them in the open ocean too. This was how the Steller's sea cow lived, albeit more on coastal kelp rather than open water sargassum, in the Aleutian Islands before its extinction. So whilst land and sea are difficult, you can still be found feeding in the treetops without being volant. And it could be worth mentioning both arboreal herbivores and the differences between rainforest and savanna subspecies. With many monkey species that aren't very frugivore slanted, there's often a preference for younger leaves and shoots, which are higher in protein and energy than mature leaves. Some treetop foragers can eat mature leaves and have them make a large chunk of their diet, but will still subsidize themselves with flowers, fruits and shoots. Whilst obviously not all rainforest herbivores are treetop dwellers, or we wouldn't have spent so long talking about duikers, but most of the accessible good food in rainforests is typically stored in the canopy, so it's only sensible that most of the animal biomass would follow it up there as well. As such, climbing groups like primates and tree kangaroos, or volant ones like macaws and hornbills, tend to dominate such communities. But large herbivores do still persist to some extent in dense rainforests, and whilst comparatively poorly studied, there is some info on how they differ to their open country cousins. Forest buffalo present a good example, and it's found they have much smaller bodies, live in much smaller groups, and cover much smaller ranges than savanna buffalo. They overall just live comparatively shrunken lives, due to the fact there's just less good food and accessible grass or herbaceous vegetation on the rainforest floor. So most movements are heavily localized to areas with the appropriate plants to eat. Savanna buffalo movements are dominated by their water dependency, and how their movements revolve around it and making sure they can drink every 2 days or so. Whereas forest buffalo in the rainforest have no shortage of fresh water, but have a similar dependency with their movements being dominated by their grazing areas, due to how few and far between good grazing spots are. The mixed feeder forest elephants are less bound to such areas, but like forest buffalo are smaller in smaller groups and at less densities than their savanna cousins. They also eat much more fruit, with forest elephant diet coming from fallen or low-hanging fruits, and then grazing in similar areas to buffaloes, with bark and leaves only forming minor chunks of their diverse forest diet. So with what herbivore eats what, it's tempting to believe herbivores have it easy. Seeing grazing animals in open plains, what a luxury it must be to have food that just sits there, not running away or fighting back, waiting to be eaten. But the notion of herbivores just being like Homer in his land of chocolate dream is erroneous. Rather, when it comes to nutrients, carnivores are the ones who have it easy. The herbivore has already done all the hard work selecting the right plants and turning itself into an energy-dense superfood with all the nutrients and minerals its predator needs. A herbivore has to pick the right plants to accrue those minerals and nutrients itself. And the two most important factors in order are generally nitrogen, in its form of crude protein, and energy. When I mentioned in the carnivore video that herbivores may be exempt from optimal foraging in some ways, this is what I mean. All the carnivore's energy is already condensed and waiting in the prey around it. It just has to make the optimal choice as to which prey it chooses to take down. A herbivore has to choose between nitrogen, in its form of crude protein, and basic energetic return, and so may go for a less optimal choice of plant energetically, as it has higher crude protein than a more energy-dense plant. It seems the priority may differ depending on circumstance, with dry grasslands especially having protein being the more important factor over energy. But all herbivores have to balance these two factors and maintain a protein-energy equilibrium, because if they don't, then the cost of digesting and metabolizing an excess of one can cost from the other. Another reason herbivores can't just eat every plant is that plants can still defend themselves. One way is via toxins, and as well as just basic toxins that can cause sickness or even death, some make themselves a lot more trouble to eat. Tannins are one such group here. Tannins are polyphenols, typically in leaves, that bind to other proteins, either making those proteins in the plants hard to break down, or binding to digestive proteins in the stomach, and preventing them from doing their job. in a way that can be severe enough to cause severe stomach upsets and reduce digestive efficiency. Tannins can be a big reason in modulating browsing, and how much of which species get eaten. A first and important line of defense against tannins is proteins in herbivore saliva, which bind to the tannins early on and prevent them from ruining things further down the line. As one would expect, with how most tannins are concentrated in leaves, browsers have more anti-tannin agents in their saliva, and may also salivate profusely when feeding on certain plants. Lack of tannin resistance can also sometimes provide a hard dietary barrier to grazers in lean periods, who may otherwise be able to partially swap to browse. Plants can also defend themselves with far worse toxins than just tannins, with some that are actually poisonous. Some herbivores, like black rhino, kudu, tapirs, and macaws, have still been seen to eat such plants, but it's worth noting their ability to do so is actually very poorly understood. For the African herbivores, the concern is much more that they may overbrowse such plants, and for the neotropical ones, it's often suggested that frequent visits to clay licks may help them out. However, some examination of this has found that it's unlikely, and it's probably more that they go to such licks for salt or other minerals. So go hog wild with poison-resistant herbivores until we find out more, really. Thorns are another defense, although many herbivores often still seem to browse thorned trees anyway. Some research shows that thorns don't entirely repel herbivores, but do slow them down significantly. And for time-limited herbivores, this may be something of a prompt to go and forage something less prickly. Thorns may not work alone though, and in some cases plants gather with ants that attack browsing herbivores. On the domestic goats used for such experiments, the ants and thorns combined were very effective, with the goats being quickly repelled, and very unwilling to browse an ant-defended plant. In some cases, thorned plants can get even worse, and their thorns may even be laden with lethal pathogens that you really don't want on or near you, up to and including gas gangrene, essentially one half of whatever Primal's mad sauropod had. This may have been and still are major deterrents greater than the prick of the thorn itself, and could be a reason for bright aposematic thorns that deter herbivores early that don't want to risk infections. Some larger herbivores do have a way around this, and the prehensile tongues of giraffes can work around thorns with little damage. Elephants can also use their trunks to break up and strip thorns too, as well as having thick skin and huge teeth to crush them up. So larger herbivores can get some partial relief from such defences, and is an advantage of being big. Big herbivores are popular full stop, and in Spec, but how do they arise evolutionarily? Giant size can come from a variety of ways, with titanotheres, or brontotheres, recently having their own method examined in depth, and interestingly gigantism and specialisation proved the salvation of brontotheres rather than their doom. Their smaller forms were packed into dense and heavily competitive niches, with high and frequent rates of extinction due to it. Those that grew considerably to become mega herbivores found unsaturated niches that had far longer evolutionary stability and success, and essentially hard-carried the family until their eventual extinction in a changing world some millions of years later. Bigness in herbivores is generally brought on by the opening of niches allowing expansion, and indeed the success of dinosaurs in the Jurassic stemmed from the extinction and reduction of the diverse clades of other herbivorous reptiles in the Triassic. This domino effect of course led to the sauropods, the largest land animals to have ever lived. Sauropods themselves can serve as something of a template for truly giant herbivores, as they have a suite of cascading features that allowed them to get so big, and haven't really been replicated since in any other group of animals. The neck in particular can be worth pointing out, in that this allows for energy-efficient feeding and cooling without a big spike in weight due to air sacs. One thing that may limit all herbivores once they get to a certain size is that the mouth isn't big enough to cram enough vegetation in for how many hours there are in a day. Sauropods also just got around this by using the entirety of the mouth to cram food in, rather than just the incisors chiefly to crop food as modern herbivores do, or using other appendages like a trunk or a tongue. This then also fits with them likely abandoning chewing, due to being so big that they can completely rely on their extra long guts to sort out food without any need for primary processing in the mouth. This also generally increases eating time a lot, and allows for a smaller head that larger sizes favour, because they can then use that head more efficiently in eating, so it can reduce in overall size relative to the nibbling mammalian herbivores. Combine this with smaller heads and longer necks getting favoured at larger sizes, and it's rather food availability over biomechanics that may limit things for them. Contrary to earlier beliefs too, sauropods neither had nor needed to rely on gastric mills, or gastroliths, to break down their food either. All this doesn't mean that sauropods are necessarily inevitable in other spec settings, but that truly giant herbivores in more grounded settings may have something of a sauropod silhouette. It also doesn't mean, despite their success, that sauropods are easily replicable. Sauropods were obligate ground nesters, and so were tied to warm climates where the soil was a high enough temperature to warm their eggs, and not freeze or starve their hatched young in their first winter. These more arid environments could also have inferior food, that the sauropods were well positioned to take more efficient advantage of. So the family as a whole were very good at warm, arid to semi-arid scrub forest and savanna, and couldn't handle cooler temperatures that may have been one factor allowing hadrosaurs to dominate in the northern US. Sauropods in general were also quite weird animals, and hard to relate to animals today. They had life history strategies that were like sea turtles, but at body sizes far larger than the largest mammal. That's a combination we have no real analogue for, and it suggested that fully mature breeding individuals would have been rare animals on the landscape, with the functioning population always being quite low, albeit with growing individuals waiting in the wings. I generally prefer peer-reviewed literature for such topics, but for a deeper dive into this, Darren Naish's Stop Saying There Are Too Many Sauropods is a great look at just how weird and different sauropods were in this regard. Whilst I've already done a whole video on herbivore aggression and its role in predator defense, I think it's worth noting that certain classes of herbivores simply can't be sold off down the river without it ultimately being world-breaking. Studies show a decrease in mortality from predation with increases in body mass, with smaller herbivores often having most of their mortality from predation, and healthy adults of larger species essentially being untouchable. As such, it doesn't matter if they pick R or K selection with their life histories. Either way, their life histories are dependent on long-living adult age classes to keep producing young. Their young can be as vulnerable as anything. Whether they're single individuals cared for by a mother or herd, or spaffed out hordes that get ground into pie crust in the first few years of life, they still need those adults to produce them. And due to their large sizes that make them so invulnerable, they'll often take a long time to grow. If you have giant, slow-growing animals that are just fodder, then how is your world keeping a population supported? And if you're bending over backwards to have such giant badass fodder species, what exactly are you trying to say with that world? It is also worth noting, being invulnerable doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're also aggressive. This is something paleo seems to go back and forth on. Hadrosaurs and sauropods especially are either doe-eyed pacifists lining up for the slaughter, or frothing sociopaths ignoring all other behaviours to kill. And they are allowed to slot in between, as animals that ignore predators that can't really threaten them, but get hostile when pushed, especially as neither strike me as good candidates for any form of hyperaggression. Herbivores also have multiple ways they can handle predators too. As well as fight, there's flight and hiding. And I'll surprise you once again and say that open versus closed habitats have differences in how they handle them. Closed habitats don't favour flight, with how many obstacles there are for you to crash into and get caught. So many closed habitat herbivores will instead have cryptic coloration to better try and hide from threats and avoid initial detection. This is often something seen in the young of many herbivores too, even ones that are much more specialised for open habitats. Families like gazelles are well known as fast, and provide good examples of animals well adapted to flight as a threat response due to having plenty of open terrain to actually safely flee into, yet they still have hiding young. Only the most specialised animals for open country have the more precocious young that are capable of running minutes after birth. Antelope groups like the wildebeest and hartebeest And equids are some examples of those very well adapted to utilising the open space for fleeing. This also ties in with sociality too, in that open country herbivores are typically more numerous, as said, and so the herd it's born into may also provide some cover as well, or even active defence in some plain species like equids or cattle. Larger herbivores especially, but many herbivores in general, can often influence their ecosystems in numerous ways. Grazing or browsing can change community structure, which can in turn affect the other animals in that ecosystem. Through their dung, they can alter nutrient flows and availability, or spread seeds so that plants can colonise new areas. Intact herbivore guilds lead to much more varied habitats, that in turn support more animals. Large animals can continue to support such changes due to their invulnerability to predators, allowing them to escape a landscape of fear. Through grazing, white rhinos can reduce fire risk and change grassland diversity. Elephants can provide food and habitat for small organisms by pushing over trees for their own food. And beavers and their dams and ponds create homes for dozens of small aquatic fauna that then enrich the waterways. In a weird example, hippos defecating into water creates a metagut, where the surrounding water has the same microbe community as inside a hippo's stomach. This can actually positively benefit the fish and other organisms that live there, as well as causing significant changes in the river systems full stop that are hard to find elsewhere, but may have occurred in other species. Overall, herbivores are key modifiers and maintainers of vital ecosystem dynamics. A spec setting is only as good as its herbivores. The last Spec Evo Long felt like it had a different tone. Whilst that one was much more an educative slap on the wrist for trying to make edgelord creatures, this one feels a lot more like a deeper look at how herbivores function, and maybe what they can be in spec, or fiction in general. A lot is generally assumed about carnivores, because people are more enthusiastic about them. You generally don't need to be told how carnivores kill, or what they kill, because you've already watched a dozen YouTube videos of safaris or documentaries, but most haven't done the same level of passive research into what herbivores eat, and how they eat it. So it felt like this video had to start at a more basic level, and then work its way up from there. Thusly, at times it felt like it was risking going into barely relevant topics, or spent too long on very niche parts, or ran the possibility of being patronising. Even the scary predator stalking or attacking protagonists gives some data as to how it pursues its prey, whereas the rare case of a belligerent herbivore more just tells you that it has a bit of a short temper, and uses fight over flight. Huge aspects of biology just aren't covered with an animal attack when it comes to herbivores. There's just generally much less to go off with. This means that there's less bad that needs addressing, but more general info that needs bringing up, and there's also just not as clear a direction to go in. But hopefully this provides a solid bedrock to start building herbivores off, of any size, shape or taxa. So thanks for watching, and as ever a huge thanks to my patrons too. Toxic Wolf, The Super Estupa, Samburgo, K. Sandom, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flygon's Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Dapperaptor, Bonecrusher Hyena, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zacer, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu, whose generosity help keep this channel going. A link is provided in the description if you would like to sign up as well, and any amount is always appreciated. As ever, let me know what you thought of this video in the comments. And if you have further ideas for Spec Evo shorts, or longs, do bring them up. There's a few planned for the future / next year, and the ideas do gradually come to me with time, but I'm always keen for more. On a semi-related note, for more in-depth views of some of the herbivores mentioned here today, you can also get Soy Lee's Dragon Slayer Codex by signing up to the Kickstarter now. As well as the Red Racers, there's plenty more herbivore species in the Burning Hills, like Lars and Canabax, as well as a whole world of creative creatures, so be sure to sign up and follow Sawyer's projects today, with links provided in the description. Next video from me will be back to Monster Hunter, which should also roughly take us up to the end of the year as well. Hopefully I'll see you there for it.